Thank you very much indeed. And I must thank NORAD and the government of Norway for making it possible for me to join this fantastic discussion today. I'm particularly grateful that the choice of focus was indeed civil society, the importance of its contribution to human dignity, to the advance of human rights, and more so than ever perhaps, there is a sense of urgency to this dialogue here so that we might better understand, weigh up its value, its unique contribution, and why it plays such an important part in the advance of human dignity and the alleviation of preventable human suffering. I want to take as said the world which the Secretary-General of Save the Children, Halle, put out so powerfully. And I want to uphold and appreciate the principles that His Excellency, the Minister, so compellingly articulated. And I want to thank the panel as well for this very deep reflection on the issues that are at hand. So if I can, I will try to add to that rather than perhaps repeat it. And it occurred to me just listening to the dialogue that perhaps it's worth spending a bit of time in this civil society space idea. There are three terms, actually, whose linkages are powerful and essential, but each of them make a contribution to that on which we are reflecting. I think it's too early for myself to start with a discussion of civil. I think I better warm up, so I'm not going to start with the civil bit, but I will start, I think, with the society bit. Just to simply notice and appreciate that our desire to form society, to associate one with the other, is as old as time. Ever since human beings first rose out of that primordial soup, I guess it was the first swamp to be drained. At that moment, and from that time forward, humans have sought, required, benefited from and enjoyed cooperative, collaborative behaviour. That's just true. We've done so for survival. We've done so for solutions to shared problems. We've done it to innovate, to invent, to elevate. And those ancient patterns of social connectedness, coordination, shape our daily lives today by our very nature, webs of action and interaction, connecting us inviolably together into social arrangements, into society. The critical thing is what sort of society, and this is where human rights, for all its limits as a conceptual framework, offers us the best we have in terms of codifying. What should that society be? It's simply a basis and a codification of the standards by which we negotiate society. Wrongly, perhaps, partly due to human rights boffins, no doubt, we associate the story and contribution of human rights as if it were exclusively a project of the individual. Don't get me wrong. Individuals are born in rights. Rights are those things that cannot be taken from us. But then I hold my rights only to the extent that they do not violate your rights. Human rights are essentially a relational project. They are not a project merely of defining the individual. And therefore, human rights are involved in our understanding of this place that we call society. They're involved as family members associate to create domestic life, as workers associate with employers to form the workplace, as consumers associate with the means of production for the purpose of consumption in the marketplace. And indeed, as members of society, associate to create reproduce, and transform social. This is the society, sitting at the middle between the civil and the space about which we've been speaking. So I want to come to the second concept, which is space. If we take it, we are inevitably in the business of being social. What is the space that should be ascribed to that exercise? Let me start with this proposition. Government, the state, is a subset of human society. It is not human society, and it is not in charge of all that is human society. It is, by definition and by scale, lesser than society. And if society, therefore, is larger than government, there is indeed space to be negotiated between the power and the responsibility of the state and of the aggregate of the individuals, noticing that individuals are rights holders. And it's that question of what is that space? How shall we create, uphold, and occupy that space which stands rightly between the state and the individual? John Rawls, perhaps the most important political philosopher of the 20th century, said, inevitably, the power of the state is coercive. No matter what non-coercive tactics the state employs, ultimately and arguably uniquely, we have invested in the state the authority to coerce and impose its will. This suggests there are two important themes, if we are to advance civil society, that we must consciously grapple with. One is all too familiar, and that is the terms on which the state may exercise its coercive power, because it includes the impositions of sanctions, and sanctions in particular against civil society actors, the sanctions of fines, the sanctions of restrictions on what can be said and how it may be said, the sanctions of punishment, and ultimately administration of deprivation of the most fundamental human rights, liberty and the right to life. And today, even as we speak, member states are exactly exercising those coercive powers against civil society actors with the most egregious of outcomes, and more commonly with impunity. But let me be clear, although that litany of examples of the way member states are violating the space between their powers and the rights of the individual, although that litany is long and pervasive and disturbing, there is a second question which we have a responsibility to answer. And that is this. To what extent is there and should there be this thing we call space for civil society? Pre-structured, minimalistically ordered and controlled space, a space between the state and the individual. Well, I want to suggest that that space is essential to society. It's not optional. It is by definition the social space. It's a space between, but touching upon the family, the government, and arguably today the market. It's a moving and shifting space in which people voluntarily, not coercively, come together to advance common interests, shield themselves against common threats, seek common approaches. If we do not invest in that space, we do not invest in society. If we don't free and open that space, we diminish, by definition, the rights of individuals to exercise that which is inalienably human, the right to freedom of expression, to freedom of assembly, to freedom of association. And it is the space where talent and innovation, creativity and freedom resides. And when that space contracts, when we do not invest in it, then freedom, human freedom is the price, and human dignity is the cost. Humans need association. That association shouldn't be coerced any more than it should be commercialised. There must be an expanse of space left over for voluntary association and that space must be regarded as precious and as of intrinsic value. So the question is not whether or not we need civic space, and within it civil society, any more than we should be wasting our time wondering how to run a society without food, without water, or without air. Space to relate must be seen as a common good and an essential precondition for human endeavour. Gandhi spoke of this space, and he spoke of it in regards to the smallest unit of society, describing the space between the individual and the state at its most coercive. He said, "You can chain me, you can torture me, you can even destroy this body. You will never imprison my mind." On scale, in the realm of the social, what Gandhi is reminding us, you cannot imprison, curtail unjustly that social equivalent which is civic space. And I can assure you that even as we meet, this indeed is the intention of states around the world. That civic space, it may be a poor and withered thing, but even in the darkest cells of the cruelest prisons, in the most fragile settlements perched high on a remote mountaintop, at the centre of resource-depleted refugee camps, moving hardly, barely, along the shoulder-wide alleys of sprawling slums, among street workers, stall owners, farm labourers, Indigenous people, there exists, without a single well-intentioned, measurable intervention from global elites, however sputtering or flickering, however overshadowed by coercive state power, still there you will find that space. That space between the individual and coercive power. And it is in that space that there must emerge then civil society. So I want to just then come and try to tackle this question of civil society. I don't think we'd want to leave any impression at all that somehow everything that takes place in that space, that civic space, is inevitably civil. And I don't just mean inevitably polite, because it's clearly not. But nor should we be deluded that somehow that there's a nirvana image of civil society or civic space. It's not as if it's only thick with like-minded groups harmoniously cooperating together to expose corporate greed, limit state power, and expand inclusion. No. Nope. Sadly, So, what on earth do we mean? And by what measure, then, should we be distinguishing that which we speak of as civil society? It's a complex question. But today, the definition of civil society appears to me to be more in the hands of those who oppose it than in the hands of those who seek to exercise it. And this is a terrible threat to those of us who believe deeply in civil society. To allow the opponent of civil society to tell us more about ourselves than we would do proactively is to run grave risk. Because as more than one scholar has suggested, civil society space is actually a bewildering array of good, bad, and outright bizarre. If we focus simply on strengthening civic space, this space, without also building a robust accountability for civil society, internally and externally, even though that feels counterintuitive, we will not flourish freedom. And we will unwittingly contribute to restrictions being imposed upon civil society. And I just think there are three things we have to recall for civil society: a commitment to common good, an adherence to the universal norms of human rights, and philanthropy, not misanthropy. In a world as globalized as ours is today, for capital, for movement of people, for data, and for information, we cannot afford a civil society that is not committed to common goods. There is no planet B. We do not need climate change to tell us that we're interconnected. And the aggregate effort of civil society must be to uphold global commons. And human rights norms must be self-identified as the discipline to which we all hold. And here we must swallow our distaste and recall that rights are for all of us, for the best and for the worst of us. They're not a beauty parade or an award for good behaviour. And they are limited to the extent, of course, that their exercise denigrates another's rights. But contrary to the claims of many political leaders, rights and responsibilities are not inseparable twins. The hydraulics of responsibilities are quite different. Responsibilities go up proportionate to authority. The more power you have, the more responsibilities you have. But we all have rights. Accountability for civil society actors is essential, yes, but it is not the issue. The issue is the disproportionate application of undue interference in civil society by coercive means of state interference under the guise of accountability. And the hydraulics of that is, the less accountable the state, the more accountability it seeks to impose on civil society. And it does so from a point of view of conflict of interest. But is the Ku Klux Klan a civil society actor? You know, I want to be very clear that civil society can't be contracted unilaterally to either the contours of my preferences any more than it should be contracted unilaterally to the whims of a single president or a state authority empowered by a single electoral cycle. The values of the KKK, of many religious groups, of an association of climate change defenders are frankly abhorrent to me. So what? So what? And the answer is, well, fortunately, we don't just have Kate Gilmore, we have multilateralism, and we have universal values. And a civil society is not possible without us all upholding those universal values. A civil society actor that is misogynist, that is homophobic, that is xenophobic, is no more acceptable than a member state who is the same. The difference is it doesn't matter as much. That's all. Because civil society does not have that coercive power. And yet, despite that, we come to this question of, should we fund? How are we funding? Under what conditions should we fund civil society? It's an important issue. And civil society requires investment because actually that's for the common good of us all. But far much more money is being spent on stopping, preventing, surveilling, inhibiting, and depriving civil society of its legitimate place. Imagine the chart of accounts if we weighed up all the efforts involved in surveillance, in stopping journalists at the borders as they seek to leave the country, in putting under house arrest civil society leaders, in organising a system of assassination across journalists and environmentalist human rights defenders of unprecedented character. The political economy investment in preventing a civil society is almost impossible to calculate, but it far exceeds this small question of why and how to fund civil society. So I want to turn to just a final thought, and it's the third piece civil society for common good, civil society upholding human rights values. The third piece came to us via a guy called Robert Putnam. He spoke some years ago about bowling alone. I don't know if you've heard of this book. And he noticed that when he was a kid in the 50s, people went bowling, 10-pin bowling. I think it's like that. 10-pin, I don't know, you don't need the details. The important thing is bowling used to be done in leagues, in teams, socially. And he observed that this was the case in the 50s, and in the 90s, today bowling is done much more individually, in families and in groups of friends. And he said bowling alone is just one of a dozen of indicators that Americans are less and less engaged in civil society. I want to suggest that bowling alone is causing a price on this world for which we've only just begun to glimpse the bill. It is a consequence of a bonding in civil society as opposed to a bridging account of civil society. And I think today, any civil society actor who cannot describe themselves in terms of how they bridge to others as opposed to create bonds to others is failing in this. Berta Cáceres was murdered this year in Honduras for her work on what? Saving the planet, Indigenous rights. Well, there have been numerous other human rights defenders criminalised, jailed. The problem of that is tragedy for Indigenous defenders and for environmentalist defenders and for LGBT activists. But we're all denigrated by it. Regardless of which lane in which we're bowling, we have to understand any time anybody is attacked for standing up for civil society, we are all attacked. Billie Holiday borrowed the words of an activist poet when she sang of southern trees bearing strange fruit, blood on the leaves, blood at the root, black bodies swinging in the southern breeze, strange fruit hanging from the popular trees. Well, on the trees of a world hell-bent on the myopia of xenophobia and violation of fundamental human values, there is strange and poor fruit hanging on populist trees. And in that world, civil society has never been needed more. And go ahead, torch every book, char every page, burn every word to ash. Civil society is incombustible. Thank you.